Again, look, I need to stress that what we're trying to cover here, I would normally spend almost a day on that first presentation that we've just done 1 hour and 10 minutes on. So we're going through this really quickly. So please don't think that there's an expectation that you would walk out of this with an absolute understanding and capacity. So let me just make that clear. What I wanted to just quickly talk about is that we'll just quickly flick through this because this is about behaviours and trying to make some sense of them. So when you're looking at things happening in your labs, what can you do about it and how can you help the guys a little bit? So we'll sort of skirt through it. What is behaviour? Everyone, in this case it's adults, but it's the same with the kids, they can have problems with language and communication, social imagination, flexibility, etc., etc. And they can put our guys under enormous stress. This is particularly true, in this case we're talking adults, but particularly true of people with ASD who can have strong motivations to develop routines and have a restricted range of interests. Challenging behaviours are destructive, harmful, disruptive or otherwise unacceptable behaviours that occur with sufficient frequency and severity to be of major concern. And the problem is that it's both a problem for the person who exhibits the behaviour, but also for you who are trying to manage people in a group when you've got 1 or 2 people whose behaviours are kind of out there somewhere and you're going, how do I manage that in this group context? And that is kind of that stuff about I want attention all the time against those who don't want it. And so the question that you've got to ask yourself is, before I become obsessed about dealing with the behaviour, how important is that behaviour and how much is it impacting? And if it's not impacting enormously, then think about how much energy you want to put into managing that behaviour before you dive into it. Because the last thing you want to do is to be taking on a behaviour that in fact you'll never have a capacity to manage because you're not with that person enough or often enough to actually manage it. So it's then about what do I do with that behaviour when that's happening, okay? And so what we try to do here is often talk about, well, we've talked about that before, so I'll move on. Identifying the behaviours. Does it matter? Use an holistic approach, prioritise, choose your battles, protect their dignity and assess behaviours versus skills. So choose your battles. If someone basically, and we often have kids who will sort of, play with their genitals in public. Is that a big deal? Well, it may be for you. Well, then look, choose the battle. If they pick their nose, if they scratch or they play with their genitals. I went to a service a few weeks ago. I walked in. It was an absolute disaster. This place, the worst place I've ever been to in my life. It was an absolute disgrace, the service, I have to say. I walked in. There was one guy running out the building, he would run round the building, he'd run back in, up and down the hallway screaming, back out again, and he did that all day. There was another guy sitting in the corridor who masturbated for 1.5 hours, and for those of you who go, God, that's impressive, the answer is, in fact, he can't masturbate properly. Because there's not a male I've ever met in my life who can actually claim to be able to masturbate for 1.5 hours. So what's actually happening is that these guys are not actually even managing to do it well. And so as a consequence, they're actually self-harming by doing these behaviours. Now they were the two classic pieces. There was another guy sitting outside, and on this day it was about 11 degrees, and he sat on the wet grass all day and not a staff member went to him for the day. And he sat there all day. So they had a lot of behaviours in this service. And what we tried to say to them is, don't try and address every behaviour of every person all the time. Pick the battle, pick the behaviour that you particularly want to address and focus on the one. And work your strategies out on the one behaviour. Then move to the next one, if there's another, and then move to the next one. But if someone's got 6 or 7 behaviours that you find not appropriate, which is the most important one and the one with the biggest consequence? So if it's taking your young fellow or the person you were talking about, if his biggest behaviour is talking about pets, and his second behaviour is talking about Pokemon, and his third behaviour is about wanting to hug everybody, which is the most important one you want to address? Don't try and address all. Pick the one, work on one, okay? Deal with one, then move to your next behaviour. Does that make sense? So don't try and do it all in one breath, because I'll guarantee you now you'll fail. Okay? It's almost a lay down the Z. It won't work. So pick a behaviour that you think's critical, work on that one. Once you've worked on that one and you feel that things are going okay, what's the next behaviour, if any, that you want to work on? Then work on that one. Yeah? Okay. So, and you want to be doing it in a way that, for me, I would never engage in a behaviour management strategy that had punishment in it. The only behaviour management strategy I use is a reward model. So if everything goes well today, Jack, at the end of the day, we're going to do this. Or at the end of the day, if things have gone well, you know, Jack, today was just a fantastic day. Thank you very much. I'm not talking about a reward model where necessarily you have to give anything, but I would give that positive reinforcement. I will never, ever, ever say to someone, if you do that again, I'm going to take this away from you. Because our guys have had that all their lives. It means nothing any longer. If you've constantly been punished, why do you think your punishment's going to make any difference? So my view is don't go down the punishment road, guys. Go down the reward model. And particularly for you guys in the lab, you might be going for an hour and a half and go with someone. If you can manage an hour and a half of doing things great, mate, I'll give you 15, 20 minutes that you can just do your own thing on the computer or whatever. Okay, what skills does the individual need? It might be those things around asking for help. It might mean that they need to be able to take a break when the day's going on, that it's just overwhelming for them. It may be that they're not actually able to communicate their needs and emotions, and so on and so on. So have a look at the people and see if you can work out what you think is the drivers of that behaviour. And generally, those are the kinds of things that will be the drivers of the behaviour, or it will be those things around the anxiety of not knowing what's coming up next. So using your kind of visual supports is really good. Consider the relationship between. We would often say that every form of behaviour, every piece of behaviour is a form of communication. And so when our guys are behaving inappropriately, they're trying to tell us something. Our challenge is to figure out what it is they're trying to tell us, of course, and that's really difficult sometimes because some of our guys' behaviours can be quite vague and quite grey. I won't use the word complex and challenging because I don't think that's unfair. I think it's more about that difficulty of being able to express. So your challenge will be how to figure out what that is. So I can't give you a simple answer for that. That'll be different for everybody that you work with. So often it'll be they don't understand what they're saying, they don't know what's happening, they may not like what's happening and have no control over it. So think a little bit about what you're doing with the guys and think about what was happening before the behaviour. And we often call that an ABC chart. When identifying behaviours, it's important to understand if they're frequent and regular or not just a bad day. So think again about one day, for example, we're talking about the boy coming in and talking about the pets and about his pet dying. Is that typical of his behaviour, or was it a one-off because he's actually lost his pet and he has to talk about it all day? If it's a one-dayer, we'll let it go because it's not going to happen again anyway. And if it does, you can say, we talked about that last week, Jack. We're not talking about that this week. It's absolutely fine. He won't be fussed because you've set the rule. Okay. But if it's something that he brings in and every week he talks about it, that might be a behaviour that you want to then address. Does that make sense? Okay. At times, the individuals we support may have no clear reinforcer for the behaviour. It may simply be an entrenched pattern. We talked about that before, that don't automatically think that the behaviour is a behaviour that's due to something. It may be that I know if I bitch and whinge, I'm going to get what I want. So I've learned that the way I get what I want is to nag and nag and nag and nag and nag. Okay? That it's not that he necessarily wants it, it's just that's what I know. And I work with a young lady at the moment, she's 21, and we know every time her mother turns up, her mother's on the scene, her behaviour escalates. And mum is totally convinced she's the person that has to be there because her child has bad behaviour. And we keep trying to say in really polite ways, she has that bad behaviour because you're there. If you're not there, she's really easy to support. But mum says, but I have to be there because she has terrible behaviour. And you go, yeah, because you're the reason for the behaviour. And it's really difficult because mum's whole life is around supporting this child. And so the definition of who she is I am the mother of this child and I am the person that's there for her. So we take this girl for a walk down the street and she takes off, and of course we won't use restraint, so she takes off, heads straight into the Coles supermarket, straight through the supermarket, out the back door and up to the station, and jumps on the train. And then she goes into the city, and then last time we went in, they had to stop the trains, they had to get the police in, they brought another train in to try and convince her to move from this train to that train because she was on the Ballarat train, and she jumped into the baggage compartment of the Ballarat train and wouldn't get out. And so, in fairness to Vic Rail, they actually brought another train into Flinders, into Spencer Street, and said, would you like to jump on this train instead? And Mum was there saying, thank God I was there, because if I hadn't have been, you wouldn't have coped. We all went, she only did it because you turned up, you bugger. So be careful again, so don't automatically assume that a behaviour is because something's going on. It may well be learned. And you'll know that as you're working with the guys, you'll get, oh, this guy just plays up because he gets what he wants out of it. Once he gets what he wants, he's calm. Well, then that's a behaviour you want to try and work on and say that's not appropriate. So look at a reward model for him not to be that way. And see if you can convince him that if he asks once and the answer is no, he doesn't ask again, but we will do this if you wait. And put that positive stuff into it. And if you come back again, I'm not going to talk to you. Well, that's not a good model, because that's just a negative model. Okay. We've really done. I'll look up there. So some of the strategies that you can use: identify appropriate replacement behaviour. I mentioned to you before, we have a little 12-year-old boy who's trashing Grandma's house. Grandma is the primary carer. Mum's has a drug dependency issue, and so Grandma's taken over this little boy. This little boy has been sexually abused, he's been violated in home care, he's had a horrific life, and so you can imagine his behaviours are quite difficult. At the moment he's kicking holes in the walls, he's punching people, he's smashing furniture, he's doing all of those behaviours. And he says it's because he's angry. So we've suggested that we get a boxing, the big punching bag things, and everyone says, oh yes, but you're teaching him to still be violent. We're going, well, we're trying to replace this really bad behaviour with a less bad behaviour, and then there'll be the next behaviour which is less again, and the next behaviour that's less again. This is the young boy that we insist shakes hands when I arrive and when I leave and that stuff. And so what we're finding now is that by putting that out there, unfortunately, he's now decided, well, that's the thing, I'll go out with a knife and I'll stab it with my knives. And I'm going, that's not quite what we wanted you to do, but we'll work on that one as well. And we'll probably give him plastic knives now, so we can't do it. But it's about looking at about trying to look at a behaviour that's really inappropriate and replacing it with something, A, that's quite good or less inappropriate. And that'll be a strategy. For most of you, that's probably not so critical for you because you're not seeing the guys that much. But again, even if there's an inappropriate behaviour, you might want to replace it with something less. So think about it. So again, for me, these are really critical. Rewarding, efficient and easy. Never punishment. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work long term. Okay, identify the behaviours, work out what the triggers are, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And so here's a star chart. This is what we often would suggest that you have. Particularly if you've got a guy in your service that does behave inappropriately, you might want to put this in. When did it happen? What was happening before the behaviour began? What was the behaviour? I know you guys have got to go. What did you do in response? And then what happened? So you can start building up a picture. So, for example, we talked about the young woman before. When we first arrived on the scene, we couldn't figure out what the behaviours were. What we realised though was when Mum wasn't around, this young girl behaved really, she's a delight to work with. As soon as Mum came back on the scene, her behaviour escalated. So by keeping this, we were able to kind of identify fairly quickly, Mum was the trigger. And look, this girl's 22, she wants to live independently. She doesn't want to live at home with Mum, but of course Mum can't see any other options. So best and most successful interventions, work on one at a time, consider as a team, so if you're working as a group, decide together what it's going to be and be consistent. The biggest challenge for people will be, I want to do this, I want to do that. You're not helping that young person because they're going to be confused now about, well, what is the behaviour that's expected of me? So as a group, if you've got somebody that you're working with, decide on share the vision about the behaviour and work together on it. Just do one last thing. Best is that works on behaviours, events that happened before. In other words, catching them doing the right thing and encouraging that right behaviour is really the way to go. So don't wait for something to go wrong. Constantly reinforce to those guys, you've been fantastic today, keep it up, it's really going well, love you being here today, it's been a real pleasure, blah, blah, blah. You're better off, you'll get more flies with honey than you ever will with vinegar. Okay? So try and remember to keep throwing that positive message out to the kids, because it's really important that they get that. Because the one thing they don't get is lots of positives. Because in the playground and in the school ground area or wherever, they're told always what they're doing wrong, not what they're doing right. I'll very quickly share with you, I was school council president. I wouldn't go to parent-teacher nights. And the principal said, look, this is a really bad example. You won't go to parent-teacher nights. And I said, look, why would I go to a parent-teacher night and be told how terrible my child is? I live with my child every day of the week. I know my child's a bugger. I don't need another person to tell me that. What I want the teachers to tell me is what my child does well. Because that's more important to me to hear the good things. I already know the bad things, if you like, because I experience that every day. And this was the adopted child, who would run away for 2 or 3 days at a time when he was 6 and 7 years of age. He was a challenging child to look after. And you're going, I don't need you to tell me the terrible things about him. I actually need to hear good things. And you need to be telling him good things, not telling him the bad things he does. Because after a while, he just thinks, therefore I'm a bad person and therefore why would I change? So that's the challenge for you guys. So, very quickly, punishment-based approaches fail to recognise the person may be unable to comprehend, so don't do them. A team response is critical. You've got clear roles. You need to understand change. Conflict will be a natural part. Openness and honesty, blah, blah. That's it. Sorry. So I'm conscious that some of you have got to go.